Video deposition obtained by Eyewitness News show how former top jail administrators under West Virginia Governor Jim Justice have struggled to deal with dire conditions at the state's correctional facilities. The depositions are being used as evidence in a federal injunction that claims mounting repairs needs of the facilities estimated at more than $200 million and an alarming number of correctional officer shortages that were ignored over the years by the governor and legislature.
Also tonight, 2 correctional officers at West Virginia Southern Regional Jail are charged in connection with an assault of an inmate who later died.
The lawsuit is the deepest look we've gotten of just how bad things could be at the Southern Regional Jail and beyond. On Monday, attorneys representing current and former SRJ inmates are going before a federal magistrate to argue that the state has been destroying evidence in their investigation. Now we're getting a first-hand look at the scope of the problems inside the facility that saw 13 inmates die just last year.
West Virginia jails and prisons have a huge staffing problem. Currently, 1/3 of the uniformed officer positions are vacant.
Hey guys, it's ayebeepee and welcome back to my channel. I have my bachelor's in criminal justice and a minor in psychology, and I'm going to say that for the next 43 videos because I'm just so proud of myself. On top of that, I'm a board member for a nonprofit called Voices for the Silenced. We help missing person cases with the friends and family, really help them get resources they need for their search. Now, we mostly do West Virginia cases, but we do reach out a little to the surrounding area. So if you know anyone around there that is missing, please reach out to us and we'll do what we can. And we are here with another one in the Unsolved in West Virginia series. Now, this one is an ongoing case. I would like to point out that everything I say was done by my own research. You go do your own research on this. And this is just for educational and conversational purposes only. Southern Regional Jail, you have enough going on. Please don't sue me for this video. Southern Regional has an interesting history just in itself. And watching how far this jail has just plummeted and just a sanitary place to live is unfathomable. And I really just would like to have a conversation with you about whether we truly believe that just because people are inmates, whether they deserve these conditions. And I would like to preface this video by saying the people that are brought into custody of Southern Regional Jail might be waiting some pretty heinous crimes, but for the most part is just low-level offenders, anything below a year in prison. So this could be shoplifting, this could be, a possession charge, and this is not necessarily any massive crimes. So again, people that do something that costs them a year or less in jail, do they really deserve to live in these conditions or even have to deal with these conditions? As a lot of you know, my capstone in college was about the American prison system. I realize this is a jail, they're different, but they are still ran pretty much in the same way. And I would also like to say before we get started that Southern Regional Jail is not an anomaly. There are a lot of jails and prisons around the United States that have these types of conditions. But what makes Southern Regional Jail unique is we have found out about not only really poor living conditions, but also the amount of deaths that are being highlighted in media that has happened within the last 2 years at Southern Regional Jail. And that was a way longer intro than we're used to. But I really thought that was important to talk about before we started so you understand my absolute passion behind this video. So let's just get right in. In 1946, there was a study that was authorized by the West Virginia legislature. They were able to find that the county level jails were not great living conditions at all for these inmates. And at this time, it was recommended to solve this problem was let's just consolidate some of the county jails into more regional jails. Now, the Law Enforcement Assistance Act helped fund this transition into regional jail system in West Virginia. But this still was not enough to meet the living conditions for the inmates. Now, changes took time to happen. And while we were waiting for these changes to happen, more issues were arising and they just could not keep up. This caused multiple lawsuits on the jail systems across West Virginia because of the really poor living conditions of the inmates. When they switched to the regional jail system, Southern Regional Jail was formed. This is in Beaver, West Virginia, and it is known to be a local level jail. Now, this jail is not ran by the county sheriff's office. It's actually ran by the West Virginia Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. It is the third highest capacity local jail system in West Virginia, and the counties that it covers is Fayette, Greenbrier, Mercer, Monroe, Raleigh, Summers, and Wyoming. It was initially built to fit 304 inmates, but they did end up expanding the facility and adding more bunks, and it reached the capacity of 584 inmates. Now, claims against Southern Regional Jail really started to surface. The first major thing I want to talk about is the major staffing issue that Southern Regional Jail is allegedly having. In January 2023, just a little bit ago, Southern Regional Jail had 1/3 of their correctional officer positions open. So they were running on 2/3 the staff as short a time ago as January 2023. The National Guard did end up coming in and filling positions that didn't have direct contact with inmates to help this staffing issue, but they never really did reach to the peak of their employment.
We was told just to suck it up, it would get better.
This is the voice of a former correctional officer who says they used to work at Southern Regional Jail. We will be using the alias Justin to identify them. We're hiding your voice. What do you fear could happen if they figured out it was you?
I feel like they'll know who I am and send a hit out on me. Not only was the inmates getting mistreated, it was a lot of the officers.
Now, there are some things you just can't forgive that staff did, like interfering with phone calls for inmates, friends, and family. They would also destroy or make copies of the inmates' mail that was most likely sent from them and their lawyers to each other. Staff also denied medical care for inmates and just seemed annoyed when they asked about receiving health care. And the inmates had also claimed that the staff beat them. Also, I want to talk about how it was completely overcrowded at a dangerous level. They could only have around 584 inmates comfortably, but they actually were housing 711 inmates. That's an insanely more amount than what they're supposed to be housing. In a 2-person cell, they were sleeping 3 to 4 people, and sometimes it was up to 6. And inmates were not given mattresses, and most of them from the overcrowding just had to sleep on the floor of their cell. There would be 70 to 80 inmates in one shower, and there were known to be 16 mentally ill inmates that were put in a suicide cell together, and they were kept there for 3 days. And remind you, those cells are only supposed to hold one person, and they put 16 together. The overcrowding also caused massive violence and is causing massive violence, because let's not forget, they are still overcrowded. These problems are currently happening. There was an uptick in attacks, and inmates are also reported to be killing each other. And officers were known to beat these inmates that would file grievances or complaints on them. And then if they needed medical care, they would pretty much document it as they slipped in the shower and fell. And also being overcrowded, most of the devices they would talk to family and friends were broken, and they just would not fix these, causing inmates to make it even harder for them to contact their families, their lawyers, or anything they were needing. I just want to point out again, these are people that have low-level crimes. Someone who just might be behind on child support should not have to be dealing with this. Now let's talk about how the building is completely falling apart. There are rats in this jail, and there is mold throughout the jail. There's busted out windows, exposed electrical wires, and some of the lights don't even work. There's also leaks that just come out of the walls at this point, and it's in serious need of some things like roofs, fences, doors, windows, and don't even get me started on the plumbing issues they have, because this made me just cringe the whole time I would read about it.
At the Southern Regional Jail in Raleigh County are documented instances of no water in cells,
Cell 1, sink doesn't work.
to toilets that won't flush.
Cell 16, toilet doesn't flush.
Mold-infested areas, unsanitary conditions, and allegations of basic human needs like medical care and food being withheld from inmates. Allegations in the press that inmates were drinking out of toilets, not being given toilet paper, and sleeping on bare floors.
And the ones that are broken that didn't cause them no water would just leak in the cells constantly. A lot of the sinks were cracked, and the toilets were usually broken and filled with insects and maggots. And these inmates are known to have to take scalding hot showers or ice cold showers, and there's not much of an in-between. And also at night, these showers are used as a toilet because the toilets don't work. And the drains in the showers are known to have to literally have human feces scooped and cleaned out of it. And this wasn't the staff doing this. It's the inmates that are having to clean human feces out of the shower with usually their hands. And the inmates that were sleeping on the floor without mattresses, or even sometimes with mattresses, were literally sleeping in the water that leaked from the toilets and the sinks. And half the time, that wasn't just water, but it was also the toilet waste. It gets me every time. I just, oh God. I cannot believe this. I cannot believe this. Now, when the Poor People Campaign got to hear about the conditions of this jail, they called this a West Virginia crisis. And they called for an investigation after being able to get a hold of 2 inmates' families that had died within this jail system, and that was Quantez Burks and Alvin Shrewsbury. And they even rallied on the Capitol steps to bring awareness to Jim Justice for this investigation. And they had a petition that had over 4,000 signatures calling on an investigation for Jim Justice. Now, there was an inmate named Calvin Mitchell, and he had a girlfriend named Katie Dunford who spoke out for him and the inmates in there. Now, this was one of the first claims that they were being denied access to water for days at a time, just in his 5-month sentence. And he was staying in B4, and that cell was found out later to be one of those with absolutely no access to water from the toilet or sink. All the way back to like November 2021. He had told his girlfriend that he only got about 2 cartons of either milk or juice a day. And sometimes they would have a pitcher of juice that they could give you, but once that was out, you didn't get any more. So you got really thirsty really fast when you were in there. He said some inmates would have toilet water they could drink, but they would have to clean their toilets before ever obviously drinking this water. Now, also, while we're talking about Calvin, let's talk about how he also blew the whistle, saying that pictures in an investigation that was done on Southern Regional, we'll talk about in just a second, were completely staged. He said the day before they came in for this investigation, inmates were given toiletries and things they need and had been complaining about not having. The next day, the investigation came in and took pictures of their cells with these toiletries in them to prove that they had them. These pictures were taken the same week of the sweep of the Corrections Emergency Response Team came. And there has also been 2 privately done autopsies on inmates that found their cause of death to be wildly different than what the jail had sold these families. And honestly, this jail has been called a third world country. Now let's get into the investigation. In December 2021, Timothy Considine was sentenced to 1 to 5 years based on a 4-wheeler crash that caused a death. He had a lawyer named Michael Witt who was arguing that he was in his mid-70s. Because of this sentence, he could actually die in jail. So he was going to argue probation for him. This man was already pretty frail, and it was thought that he couldn't sustain the jail lifestyle. And each time Michael Witt saw his client, he looked worse and worse. And he did. He filed a motion to be either moved facilities or able to go home for the rest of his sentence. On March 30th, 2022, the governor's chief of staff, Brian Abraham, called Jeff Sandy and told him to get to the jail and figure out what everybody has been talking about.
Sandy, who was State Homeland Security Cabinet Secretary at the time, said he was ordered to go to the facility by Justice Chief of Staff Brian Abraham.
Why did the governor order this investigation?
Because of all the negative media that was out there concerning Southern Regional Jail. Those were the main things that they were interested in, was water, toilet paper, and mattresses.
Nothing about staffing, overcrowding, a growing number of inmate deaths, or anything other than water, toilet paper, and mattresses. Sandy said he only personally talked to 3 inmates who were handpicked by jail leaders and several COs. 10 more inmates were interviewed by another investigator a week later. He said he didn't step foot inside a cell, didn't check sinks, showers, or toilets.
Did not go into any pod, did not go into any cell. I went to the observation area and looked down on multiple pods.
Test the water from there?
Did not test the water from there, sir.
Sandy said he hadn't been told about a walkthrough and documentation of the shape of the jail just a few months prior, when these videos and pictures were taken by a lieutenant.
No means of working communication from cell to tower. So after lockdown, they'd have to beat on the doors.
But later he testified he wished he had. About a month later, the governor's office published Sandy's 14-page report, concluding nothing was wrong at the jail. They called the allegations made in the news simply not true.
It is correct, sir. I stand by the report.
In the jail itself, just told Jeff Sandy, well, there's no grievances or complaints written about no access to water or the plumbing conditions. And Sandy just took their word for it. Just took their word for it. And in April 2022, and a spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security completely confirmed the jail was under investigation. And this was after a federal class action lawsuit was brought against some of the correctional officers and inmates. There were many questions about the conditions of this jail, and they claimed they wanted to hold the bad actors that was causing this cover-up of how the jail was accountable. And they said they were going to continue to work with the federal government to bring this jail back to safe and secure conditions. On April 7th, 2022, at around 5:30 a.m., Lieutenant Bobby Berry was checking the lighting system, and he had to do it early because it was better to check it during the dark. And at 7:30 a.m., Lieutenant Bobby met the CERT team at the Tamarack to really talk about a plan on how to approach the search of this jail. And they looked at every corner of this jail for contraband and things like that. And when they did this, they were able to find quite a bit of the security risks. And by 8 a.m., the search had started. And they took 2 days going from cell to cell to cell to cell, sweeping the whole place. And not just taking their word for it like Jeff Sandy did, allegedly. Now, these types of searches are supposed to be done on the jails every 1.5 to 2 years. There had never been a search like this done on Southern Regional Jail. Never. Not once. In October 2022, attorneys that were representing the inmates and correctional officers started calling this initial investigation a sham, a complete sham.
Just a powder keg at the Southern Regional Jail for the longest time.
Beckley attorney Stephen New is representing current and former inmates at the Southern Regional Jail in a class action lawsuit focusing on conditions inside the facility.
This isn't being soft on crime. The 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution and the West Virginia Constitution talk about cruel and unusual punishment, and there's lots of case law about where the line gets crossed from this is jail and it was not designed to be a comfortable situation to the point where it does get unconstitutional. I believe we crossed that line in West Virginia a long time ago.
New thinks the new legislation is simply too little, too late.
Within the Justice Administration, they have the ability to fix a lot of these issues, especially when a state's sitting on a $1.8 billion budget surplus.
Attorney New also said these inmates were handpicked to give good reviews on the jail. He said they were bribed and threatened to give good reviews. And with this, they really tried to downplay the conditions and really start their cover-up. Calvin Mitchell, that we talked about earlier, was actually one that gave a statement. And Governor Justice even said that he called for an investigation the minute he heard about inmates drinking from toilets, sleeping on the floor, and that they weren't given toilet paper.
State of emergency has been declared at all corrections facilities across the state. Governor Jim Justice says that the severe funding and staffing shortages at many jails and juvenile facilities and prisons have led to this declaration. The emergency comes at a time when many counties are struggling to pay their jail bills and want more state aid to help. The governor promises to address it.
And that is really when the National Guard came in to help. And there was even a third investigation that was done on the facility that wrapped up in March 2023. Now, in January 2023, there was quite a few overdoses in Southern Regional Jail.
Sunday, according to a statement released by Governor Jim Justice's administration, 7 inmates at the Southern Regional Jail gave the appearance of experiencing a drug overdose. Eyewitness News has learned there were 5 women and 2 men, all inmates, transported and treated in a hospital. The statement says there were no deaths and that the inmates are now back behind bars. The incident is under investigation by the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Criminal Investigation Division and the West Virginia State Police. They were suspected but not confirmed of being fentanyl overdoses.
I had tried my hardest to find everyone that had died within this jail system to talk about over the past 2 or 3 years to really, bring awareness to who these people were. But unfortunately, that was a really hard task, so I did my best. And some of them, there was just hardly any details on, so I did, again, my best. I also put them in chronological order because I thought it was an easy way to tell how they kept getting ballsier and ballsier the more they were getting away with how this jail was ran and honestly taken care of. Now, there has been around 100 deaths in the past decade at Southern Regional Jail. There's been 25 alone in the past 5 to 6 years and around 19 in the last 2 to 3 years. Timothy Considine died in February 8th, 2022. We talked about him a little earlier. Then Alvis Shrewsbury was 45 years old, and he is someone I had mentioned briefly earlier. He was in Southern Regional Jail for about 6 months due to a suspended license and DUI charge. There was a lot of inmates that were honestly just beating him up and just being extremely violent towards him. And these attacks on him were gnarly and they were happening almost daily. He was also being denied food and water at this point. And the inmates would just take his food tray every time he got it, making it unable for him to eat because damn well that jail was not giving him another plate. He was also being denied medical care. He kept complaining about abdominal pain and saying that he felt like he had broken ribs, which is, probably happening from these brutal attacks. And when he did get medical care, they would literally tell him nothing was wrong with him. And he ended up dying on September 16th, 2022, just 19 days after he was incarcerated. This part makes me infuriated, so bear with me. But the jail ruled it a natural death, saying it was a gastrointestinal bleed, because he probably did have internal bleeding from being beat every day. And it has been proven that the correctional officers knew this was happening the whole time, all the way up till his death. And they never stepped in. Not once. Now let's talk about Douglas Cunningham. He was a 79-year-old man, and he was put in a suicide watch pod. It is said that the officers brought him in there on a wheelchair and then just put him on the floor. He had 2 cellmates, Isaiah McBride, who was 27, and Lucas Wagner, who was 28. Once Douglas was brought into the cell, Isaiah and Lucas started calling him a child molester. They also started spitting on him and urinating on him. Isaiah then penetrated him with an object while Lucas jumped off the top bunk and landed on Douglas. And then Isaiah ended up just kicking him over and over in the kidney area. He was found unresponsive on October 29th, 2022 at 3:05 p.m. An ambulance raced him to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead about 40 minutes after he got there. Now, his 2 cellmates were charged with his homicide. Isaiah claimed that he was sexually abused as a child, and that this just really triggered him, but he said he only hit him in the face. That's all he did. Now, Lucas, on the the other hand, said he was asleep the whole attack and that Isaiah did everything. And he said that he woke up around 3 a.m. and found that Douglas was dead. Now let's talk about what the medical examiner found when it came to Douglas. He had bruising on his face. He had broken ribs that were not consistent with CPR. He had a few things that contributed to his cause of death. He had coronary artery disease with high blood pressure, diabetes, but the big thing was he had blunt force trauma to the head, chest injuries, abdominal injuries, and this could all have caused internal bleeding. So they were able to rule his manner of death a homicide. Now let's talk about Kimberly Gilly. She was in jail for a violation on her probation from her previous shoplifting charge. She died in the custody of Southern Regional Jail in December 2022. She was brutally assaulted by female inmates who believed she was hiding drugs inside her. And she died from not receiving proper medical care after this brutal sexual assault. Okay, we also had mentioned Quantez Burks earlier. He was in there for a wanton endangerment charge and obstructing an officer. Quantez had bumped into one of the officers, and this group of officers did not think that he should, I guess, get away with it.
The criminal complaint alleges the two men were attacking Burks while he was restrained. Burks' mother told Eyewitness News earlier this year her son died from blunt force trauma. Court documents say both men are expected to plead guilty at a future hearing.
37-year-old Quantez Burks died in custody after being at the Southern Regional Jail for less than 48 hours. The state said he died of natural causes, but a private autopsy proved otherwise.
Burke's mother says the state claims he died last March from hypertensive cardiovascular disease. She says a private autopsy indicates he didn't get there natural.
Findings were consistent with being handcuffed while being beaten. Both of his wrists were broken. He had an arm broken, nose broken, and a leg bone broken. He also had blunt force trauma to his whole body, including his head.
There was a culture there. I mean, we've got 8 people facing federal felonies as a result of this, 2 of which have already pled. It went, from at least the leadership within the jail all the way down to the guards themselves, having some type of culture of wanting to keep the truth away from the public.
Burke's family suspected a bigger cover-up after it took a private autopsy to show Burks was apparently beaten to death while handcuffed.
I still stand on what I said from my very first interview, that people would be held accountable for what they did.
The civil rights case against ex-jail guards Mark Holdren, Corey Snyder, and Jonathan Walters alleges they beat and handcuffed Burks while Jacob Booth and Ashley Toney failed to intervene in the unlawful assault. All 5 correctional officers, as well as former Lieutenant Chad Lester, were also charged for covering up the use of unlawful force. 2 other former COs, Steve Wimmer and Andrew Fleshman, have already pled guilty to conspiring to violate the 37-year-old inmate's civil rights and face up to 10 years in prison. For 5 of these defendants, this is effectively a federal murder trial with a potential maximum penalty of life in prison.
It's a civil rights violation, and it will essentially, be treated as a murder by the courts, or a death, an unlawful death by the courts, because he had the right, of course, to be treated humanely while he was incarcerated, and being beaten to death is certainly not being treated humanely.
Now let's talk about Rick Riston. He was 45 years old, he was a father of 5, and he was also the nephew of our West Virginia Secretary of Transportation, Jimmy Riston. He was booked because he was obstructing an officer, could not comply to orders because he was so inebriated, public intoxication, and indecent exposure. Now, Ricky did not receive medical clearance to get into this jail system, but he was placed into a booking cell. He was banging his head as hard as he could on the cell walls. He was flopping and flailing, and he was just moving very erratically. They placed him in a restraint chair and left him there for 5 hours. 5 hours. He got severe abrasions on his wrist and ankles from this because his body was still like trying to flail. So it was yanking on it and rubbing on it. It was horrible. They finally brought him back to his cell where he was still flailing around. And later the officers said they could smell blood coming from Wriston's cell. And when they checked, blood was everywhere. And it was found out that these officers used disgusting language to and about Ricky Wriston. Just very inappropriate and unprofessional comments about him and what had happened to him. They had denied medical care, especially mental health care to Wriston, and this was clear that it caused his death. He was clearly in a mental episode, right? And when the autopsy came back, it came back of lack of blood and oxygen to his brain and blunt force trauma to the head causing it. Now let's talk about William Samples. He was in jail for, I'm not kidding you, child support. He was found dead in his cell from a self-inflicted wound around March 2023 during like a routine check. Now, the family did question whether this was self-inflicted because he had been complaining of inmates bullying him and threatening him. And Herbert Doss, who was about 48, died in custody after about 3 months in the middle of March. Now let's talk about Scotty. He was 45 years old and he had called 911 during a mental episode. He said that his family was trying to attack him, and when the officers got to his house, he used that opportunity to attack the officers. And he was placed in jail for 4 counts of battery on a law enforcement officer, 1 count of attempting to disarm a police officer, and 1 count of obstruction. 3 days later, on August 28th, 2023, he was found unresponsive. He was rushed to CAMC, but was pronounced dead later on. Now, on February 21st, 2023, there was a federal class action lawsuit filed.
It's just a powder keg at the Southern Regional Jail for the longest time.
Beckley attorney Stephen New is representing current and former inmates at the Southern Regional Jail in a class action lawsuit focusing on conditions inside the facility.
This isn't being soft on crime. The 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution and the West Virginia Constitution talk about cruel and unusual punishment, and there's lots of case law about where the line gets crossed from this is jail and it was not designed to be a comfortable situation to the point where it does get unconstitutional. I believe we crossed that line in West Virginia a long time ago.
New is also filing a federal injunction against Governor Jim Justice and others. He wants to force the state to do $270 million in deferred maintenance and spend at least $60 million to fill vacancies. Corrections officials echoing the same sentiment in recent deposition videos obtained by Eyewitness News that the governor and legislature have repeatedly been told about the dire conditions and needs that have gone unmet and unfunded for years.
Prior to every legislative session, we have meetings with the budget office. We provide them with our needs. Our needs were clearly articulated along with all other Homeland Security agencies. They're advised of that. We transparent, we tell them.
Depositions also painting a questionable picture of an investigation ordered by Justice into the Southern Regional Jail in March 2022.
And they pretty much claim that the living conditions in Southern Regional were a complete violation of their 8th Amendment. And it was ruled that it would take over $300 million for all the repairs in Southern Regional Jail. And it also claimed that the governor and legislature had been told over and over about these conditions. And they had even said they would need around $270 million in just deferred maintenance that was completely ignored. And then they would also need like $60 million in job vacancies.
You asked the question, how did we get here? How did we get to $200 million of deferred maintenance?
I'm sure that everybody asks that question, and the answer was we depend on the money that's allotted to us. Every year there's a certain amount that is allotted for maintenance, but it doesn't touch what the overarching bill is.
Former Corrections Commissioner Betsy Jividen said she was pressured to resign in July 2022 over the death of a family member of one of the governor's cabinet secretaries.
Who gave you word that the governor wanted you gone?
Jeff Sandy.
And why did the governor want you gone?
I can tell you what Jeff Sandy told me.
Okay, do that.
Jeff Sandy told me that Brian Abraham was upset about Secretary Riston's nephew dying in the hospital after being incarcerated at Southern, and that he had gone to the governor, and that's when the governor had asked for my resignation.
Who is Secretary Riston?
Secretary of Transportation.
In his testimony, Sandy denied it happened, and Jividen said she'd been debating stepping down before that incident out of sheer frustration.
Not being able to get the pay raises, not being able to do the maintenance. It was very frustrating.
And the final thoughts I have is just Southern Regional Jail did not get this way on its own. This is a type of lifestyle and conditions that we just think the jail is acceptable to run on. The culture of the jail starts at the superintendents and trickle down. We have to have people in power that believe of the humanity of these victims in this jail, because yes, they might have done something wrong, got charged for it, but again, these are not murderers. This is an absolute civil rights violation that we are allowing these inmates to live in, and there has to be something done about it. Thankfully, with some of these lawsuits that I couldn't even touch on all of them, but there's multiple, and hopefully that does get the traction going on making this a better place. These types of inmates that are in Southern Regional Jail are going to be out soon if they're not killed in there first. So let's take the death side away from it. There's way too many people dying in that jail for, just absolutely avoidable reasons, right? But let's just talk about the people that get out for a second. And if they are living in these conditions, complete survival mode, they are not going to be in the mindset to just go straight back to our society and be the way we assume they should act in society. They're going to have some major mental health issues, if not actually just physical health issues after leaving a place like that. And that does not help anybody. That doesn't help society releasing people in these honestly trained conditions you have put them in. Most of the time people get out with a lot more issues than when they went in. It's not just the correctional officers being violent, it's also the inmates being violent. This is a never-ending cycle. We have to try our hardest to find a way to stop. When you have a sentence for that long, we should be working on rehabilitation, making them a better person to go back into society and not make these smaller type of mistakes they made compared to most inmates. These people can turn their lives around with the right direction, but putting them in a situation that they have to be in fight or flight for possibly up to a year or longer is never, ever going to work in our favor. And I really hope this brings awareness to some of the issues happening in Southern Regional Jail. Again, this was all just research on my own. Southern Regional Jail, you have a lot going on. Please don't put me on that list. Do you guys have any experience in Southern Regional Jail or have a family member, friend that had been there? Please leave in the comments below how their experience was, even if it was complete opposite from what I was explaining. But please leave in the comments below your experiences or experiences of your friends or family members. And thank you guys so much for watching. Like and subscribe for me, and hit that notification button. That way you're notified the next time I upload. And I, of course, still have a GoFundMe going for Crystal Young. If you have not watched that video yet, go watch it so you know why her mom needs this PI so bad. And I still have stickers for sale. They're $2 each, and all proceeds go to the Cold Case Foundation. So it is for a good cause. And thank you guys again so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.